And once again, I want to say greetings to each and every one of you, Aquala, and welcome. Welcome to another round of the Conscious Rasta Report here on LIB Radio, LIB TV, here on livinginblack.com. My name is Keity Owadu, aka the Conscious Rasta. Weekday mornings, you and I get together live. We come at you from 9 a.m. Pacific Time. That's 12 noon Eastern Time, 5 p.m. BST, and 8 p.m. East Africa Time. We get together with you and we deal with culture, consciousness, historical perspectives. We deal with entertainment, economics, education, health, labor, law, politics, religion, family, conflict, future studies, all areas of human interactivity and development. Today's date is Friday. It is the let me get this right. It is Friday the 12th of September, 2022. In the 2025 in the Western calendar, this corresponds to the year 6266 in the Kemetic calendar, to which we have realigned our cultural clock. Welcome to the 7th millennium. You have found your family in a peaceful place here on LIB Radio, LIB TV, here on livinginblack.com. It's always exciting clicking all of these buttons and then going through this conversation that I've memorized. I've been saying for 20 something years, different variations thereof. But it's always exciting putting the show together. And I think I have a good program that you should enjoy today. Let me tell you what this program is about. And let me just say this much. I don't gaslight you on LIB Radio. Meaning feed you hype, hysteria, distortions of the truth, irrelevant stories, unimportant stories. I don't think you deserve to be gaslighted. And in doing what I do the best I can to bring you relevant programming every day, every week, week after week, on your favorite LIB radio network. So doing what we do, and I'm trying to find the right background for today. Let's go to the village. Doing what we do, we have to get serious. I want my audience to be the most well-informed audience of any podcast existing. I'm serious. I want you to be the most well-informed. This week we've debunked a bunch of fake videos about Ibrahim Traore in Burkina Faso. I hope that one stuck. And then yesterday, we took on the assassination of Charlie Kirk. Now, I'll be honest with you. Before doing the program yesterday, I knew who Charlie Kirk was. I think all of us knew who Charlie Kirk was. But I really didn't pay attention to Charlie Kirk. And then after the program, I started looking at these various websites of people who they were not celebrating the assassination of the man. They were not celebrating his assassination. People should not celebrate assassinations. That's just bad karma. That's not ma'at. But I did notice that Charlie Kirk had painted himself into such a deep, dark, anti-Christian position. He was not a Christian, no matter what Donald Trump says. And if Donald Trump says he's his hero, then you know there's got to be something really messed up about this guy. But Charlie Kirk was not a Christian. He was not a Christ character. He was not following the tenets of Christ. He was hateful. That's just simple. So after yesterday's program, I did put a few addendums up on the Facebook page. So those of you who wish to have more insight as to the nature of Charlie Kirk, you need to watch these other videos by other YouTube streamers, not myself. I didn't have time for him. I do have time for today's topic. It's a very important topic in the world. U.S. versus China, the battle for the future of Latin American relations. This is incredibly important. Incredibly important. Today on LAB Radio, at least 10 countries in Central and South America have experienced deteriorating relations with the U.S. under President Trump and in recent decades, and are actively turning toward China to fill the gap. This includes diplomatic recognition shifts, infrastructure development, and participation in the Belt and Road Initiative. Today, we describe rising tensions with the U.S. under Trump across South America and Central America, as well as a move by these nations toward greater cooperation with China and the BRICS Plus partnership. These Latin American countries span Brazil, Cuba, Chile, Colombia, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Mexico, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. That is what's on the table today. And when we combine all of these countries and the importance that they have in the world today, I think we can see this is a very, very important story. Very important story. So I invite you, our listening audience here on LAB Radio, to join us today. Hit the like button in case you are very interested in today's program. Let me know where you are, where you're listening from. I'd love to hear from you today. So we're going to go ahead and get right deep into this topic. I got quite a bit of research on the table today. I keep threatening to get a TikTok account and do short videos, but as I am to a great degree a creature of habit. And personally, I like the extended videos. I like getting a lot of research in. But it's not always what I like. It's what we can use. Latin America, U.S. tensions. The relationship between Latin American nations and the United States has experienced notable strain over the past decade, shaped by shifting geopolitical dynamics, economic competition, and differing political priorities. While cooperation persists in areas like trade and security, rising anti-American sentiment and assertions of regional autonomy have marked a departure from earlier U.S. dominance in the hemisphere. U.S. dominance in the hemisphere is no longer is the case. A key factor in rising tensions has been the increasing influence of non-Western powers, particularly China, in Latin America. By the early 21st century, China's trade with the region grew 14-fold between 2000 and 2008, 14-fold in 8 years. China's trade with the region grew 14-fold. That's quite an amazing statistic. And has since become a top trading partner and investor in countries like Peru and Venezuela. This growing presence has reduced U.S. leverage and prompted Latin American nations to pursue greater economic and political independence from Washington. U.S. foreign policy actions have also reignited historical grievances. The Trump administration's recognition of Juan Guaido as Venezuela's interim president in 2019, coupled with its refusal to rule out military intervention, was widely perceived across Latin America as a revival of interventionist policies. This echoed past U.S.-backed regime changes during the Cold War, such as in Chile, Guatemala, and drew criticism from regional leaders and U.S. politicians alike. Senator Bernie Sanders explicitly warned against repeating the mistakes of past interventions, stating, quote, "We must not go down that road again," close quote. And look at what's happened in recent. The U.S. now is sending warships, declaring a war against drug smuggling in the Caribbean and South America. Now, declaring a war against drug smuggling, that's not going to be a problem unless you inaccurately point your finger at those doing the smuggling. And in shooting a Venezuelan boat that was apparently, latest I've heard, the boat was headed back south towards South America, away from the U.S. That there was no trial, there was no direct identification. They didn't know who was on the boat. I don't know. I'm only recalling what others have said. We can look a little bit more into that. But the shooting and the killing of everyone on that boat was problematic. Additionally, the U.S. attempt to remove Nicolas Maduro from power, regime change, was described by the New York Times as, quote, Washington's most overt attempts in decades to carry out regime change in Latin America, close quote. Further fueling regional skepticism. While the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela under Maduro has been severe, the U.S. approach has been seen by many as undermining sovereignty and direct provocation. If there is a humanitarian crisis in Venezuela, and I'm not saying that there is not, what does it stem from? From the boycotts? From U.S. policies towards Venezuela? From covert and overt manipulation? What does it stem from? Additionally, the U.S. attempt to remove, I read that. Latin American countries have grown more assertive in rejecting U.S. influence. Domestically, the decline of the U.S. and the IMF influence on national policy has been linked to greater economic prosperity and democratization since the late 1980s. Countries increasingly rely on transnational institutions like NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, now the USMCA, Mexico-Canada Agreement, to manage disputes, highlighting the importance of structural cooperation over unilateral pressure. Overall, rising tensions stem from a combination of historical mistrust, U.S. interventionist rhetoric, and Latin American pursuit of multipolarity in global relations. While security cooperation continues, especially with Colombia and Mexico, Latin American nations are increasingly resistant to perceived U.S. overreach. perceived U.S. overreach. So at this particular point, I'm going to share a video that I have pulled up here in the background. I'm going to put this into my Rumble chat, and for some odd reason, I guess maybe it's not so odd, but I don't have much interest. I don't have anyone who said hello to me in Rumble. Let me go ahead and check on my YouTube backup, and no one talking to me on Rumble, no one talking to me on YouTube. This is quite puzzling. It is what it is, and we're going to do the best we can. I have pulled up this piece of video I'm going to add to the stage, and this piece of video is from Rumble. It is entitled U.S. Indifference versus Chinese Influence in Latin America. You tell me if you're interested in talking. You tell me what you think about this short video. Actually, it's not that short. It's a little over 4 minutes, 5 minutes long. I'm probably going to pause before it gets to the end. In fact, I know it well. I did watch it a little bit earlier. Let's share this short piece of video.
This is China's President Xi Jinping, who has visited 11 countries during 5 separate trips to Latin America since taking power in 2013. The visits do come with a benefit, as China's economic investment in the region has been flourishing. In a visit to Brazil, the Chinese president signed 40 trade and development agreements following the G20 meeting in November. That same month, Xi also inaugurated the China-funded Chancay port in Peru during a week-long diplomatic tour. In 2022, China was the region's second most important trading partner after the US. However, it was the top exporter to the region's biggest economy, Brazil. But this change in influence did not happen overnight.
20 years ago, or 2001, China didn't appear as the most important 15 economic partners for Brazil. US was on the top. And in 2021, again 10 years, China was the first one already, and basically 30% of the Brazilian exports go to China.
So how did all of this happen? Experts attribute the shift to the different approaches the world's 2 most powerful economies have taken in the region.
Latin America has been seen for many years as a backyards of US.
Using its sphere of influence, the US routinely interfered in the politics of the region's countries as well, including backing multiple coup d'etats against democratically elected governments. As revealed in the Harvard Review of Latin America, the US supported coups against elected presidents in Cuba between 1906 and 1909, in Panama in 1941, in Bolivia, Dominican Republic, Honduras, and Guatemala in 1963, in Brazil in 1964, and in Chile in 1973. The US also occupied Nicaragua between 1912 and 1933 to protect American business interests, and invaded Panama in 1989. Other cases of US interventionism in the region include assassination attempts, some of which were successful, against people who didn't align with Washington's economic interests.
If we think about 60s or 70s, when US had quite a lot of influence in Latin American internal politics, the economic interests of US came together with some political influence, sometimes even for bad, supporting dictatorship, deposing governments, democratically elected.
Following all these controversial engagements with the region over the course of many decades, Washington's policy towards Latin America went through a major change after the Cold War, resulting in what some people have dubbed indifference.
But since especially the end of the Cold War, so we start to see a more focused US policy towards Middle East.
This indifference is illustrated by the lack of US ambassadorships to some Latin American nations, with ambassadors to countries including Colombia, Bolivia, Venezuela, and the Dominican Republic still pending appointment by the US Senate, and the Bahamas having no US ambassador since 2011, as well as by the fact that President Biden waited until the end of his term in November 2024 to make his first presidential visit to the region, and did so to attend APEC and G20 meetings, not as a dedicated diplomatic trip. Furthermore, during Donald Trump's first term as president, he only visited the region once and only went to Argentina, again for a G20 meeting. Washington's increasingly distanced approach is also accompanied by a tougher stance on immigration from the region. The US presidential campaign was marked by deportation promises, targeting irregular migrants from Latin America. During the tenures of both Biden and Trump, it remained the top issue on the country's political agenda.
So many Central American or Caribbean people that, or even South America that migrate and try to enter illegally in US, it is a very crucial point for the relationship of Latin America with United States of America.
For now,
All right. That is, we're going to cut it at this point. All right. And let me just mute the sound there. That was not a bad piece of video. You can see the many, many different conflicts. Any country that would have to suffer these interventions, CIA overthrowing your leadership, supporting fascist right-wing governments across the region. And it is ongoing, continuing. As those nations gain autonomy, sovereignty, and development, they're increasingly going to be very resentful for U.S. policies. No doubt. So we ask the question of you, our listening audience. I hope that we are paying attention. I do see my brother Moja, brother Daoudi, checking in from Ghana. Hello, tap brother Kidi from Ghana. Respect, enough respect to you, my dear, dear brother. And thank you for tuning in today. Thank you for checking in and letting us know that you do care about Latin and U.S. relationships and Latin and China relationships. There are significant numbers of African people across Latin America. In the book Disaster Preparedness, I think that's the book in it. I did my best to count the people across Latin America. I did it in a recent book. It was either that one or The African Future. And the numbers exceed 130 million people. Quite a bit. Far exceed 130 million. I can't remember the exact number here. Let me see if I can get that number for you, because you do need to know that you are well represented across Latin America, Afro-Latinos. And I have the African Future book in hand, and I want to talk, we're talking about demographics. Here we go, demographics. Let's go to the chapter, the developing the global African diaspora. And here is Africa in the Western Hemisphere, CARICOM and Latin American. Who are CARICOM people? Indigenous people, Africans, Indians, Europeans, Chinese and Portuguese, Garifuna, Suriname, Tainos, Maya, Siboney. Those are the original people. Now, these groups have found themselves across Latin America, much of which deals with this today: Anguilla, Antigua and Barbados, Aruba, Bahamas, Bermuda, Barbados, Belize, Cayman Islands, Cuba, Curacao, Dominica, Dominican Republic, Grenada, Guadeloupe, Guyana, Haiti, Jamaica, Martinique, Montserrat, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Suriname, Trinidad and Tobago. Now, that's just the CARICOM basin. Then we're looking at Afro-Latino. Now, let me get the specifics on Afro-Latinos. I know I did target it because there's a lot of Afro-Latinos. And we go through, here we go, the Afro-Latinos. We talk about black majority nations, but Afro-Latinos, I'm going to have to just take it off the top of my head. We talk about Brazil, the Quilombo people of Brazil, and there's total Hispanic Latino or Afro-Latinos. Approximately, this is in the U.S., 14 million Afro-Latino adults and children in the United States. Now, I don't have it across South America, and I'm sorry that I don't. It should be some numbers here on Colombia, because there are a lot of Afro-Latino people in Colombia. But I'm not, bear with me, I'm not finding it as I quickly look at the book. Colombia, page 64, that's where it's going to be. So page 64, we're talking about Colombia. And we're talking about quilombos. And so such communities are found in Colombia, Ecuador, Suriname, Honduras, Belize, and Nicaragua. These are quilombos across the region, contemporary quilombos. And they're also found extensively in Brazil, Panama, etc., etc. So the book, The African Future, I do the best I can to tally all of the African people around the world. So let's get back to topic. U.S. and Brazil, deteriorating relations. That's the subject today. U.S. versus China, the battle for the future of Latin American relations. Let's look at U.S. and Brazil. Brazil-United States relations over the past decade, 2015 to 2025, have experienced recurring tensions and shifting political leadership, divergent foreign policies, and growing geopolitical competition, particularly with China. Relations improved significantly after a 2013 diplomatic crisis over U.S. surveillance of President Dilma Rousseff, culminating in her 2015 visit to Washington. From 2016 to 2019, ties remained fairly positive under U.S. Presidents Barack Obama and Donald Trump, and Brazilian President Michel Temer. However, under President Jair Bolsonaro, 2019 to 2022, relations with the Biden administration cooled due to political disagreements, including on climate change and democracy. Although Bolsonaro's alignment with Trump have previously strengthened bilateral relationship in trade and defense, while Luiz Ignacio Lula da Silva returned to the presidency in 2023, U.S.-Brazil relationships initially stabilized, marked by high-level visits, a $500 million U.S. pledge to the Amazon Fund. And of course, it goes on, it deteriorates. Despite this cooperation, tensions resurfaced in 2025 following Donald Trump's re-election and renewed protectionist policies. U.S. launched a Section 301 investigation into Brazil, citing digital trade practices like the PIX payment system, intellectual property concerns, and alleged unfair trade advantages. In July 2025, Trump threatened and then imposed steep tariffs, initially up to 50% on most Brazilian goods, as retaliation for Brazil's judicial prosecution of former President Bolsonaro, who just today, September 12th, 2025, in the Western calendar, just today, it was announced Bolsonaro was convicted, what's it called when you're out of the country, in exile, by Brazilian courts of attempting to overthrow militarily, or the violent overthrow of the Brazilian government after he lost the election. And he was sentenced to 27 years imprisonment. And he is in Miami being protected by Donald Trump. But he was sentenced in Brazil, Bolsonaro sentenced today to 27 years in prison. Whew. When Luis Ignacio Lula da Silva returned to the presidency in 2023, U.S.-Brazil relations initially stabilized, marked by high-level visits and a $500 million U.S. pledge to the Amazon Fund. Despite this cooperation, tensions resurfaced in 2025 following Donald Trump's re-election and renewed protectionist policies. U.S. launched I read this already. In 2025, Trump threatened and then imposed steep tariffs, initially up to 50% on most Brazilian goods, as retaliation for Brazil's judicial prosecution of former President Bolsonaro, which Trump labeled a witch hunt. Trump is also labeling Charlie Kirk as a national hero worthy of his presidential Medal of Honor. So, Bolsonaro, do you get Donald Trump's presidential Medal of Honor? This inference was widely condemned in Brazil, with President Lula calling it unacceptable. The tariff measures exempting only aircraft, orange juice, and energy sectors triggered a diplomatic and economic backlash. Analysts note the bilateral relationship has reached its lowest point in decades, with potential for further U.S. actions, including expanded financial sanctions. These coercive economic measures are seen as part of a broader shift toward geoeconomics, where trade tools are weaponized for strategic and political aims, pushing Brazil to accelerate de-dollarization and deepen ties with China and BRICS plus nations. Additionally, Lula's autonomous foreign policy, such as his diplomatic outreach to China and comments on the Ukraine war, has occasionally clashed with U.S. priorities, reinforcing Washington's strategic concerns about Brazil's alignment. Institutional cooperation, such as the U.S.-Brazil ATEC Commission, ATEC, has not met since 2016, signaling a weakening of structured bilateral engagement. As of September 2025, the relationship remains strained, with little prospect of near-term de-escalation. Next, I went to search engines, AI search engine, and I asked to list Central and South American nations with deteriorating relations with the U.S. I asked it to describe how these nations' relations have declined under President Trump, how many of these nations are turning toward China to fill in the gap. This response is limited to Brazil. Well, that previous response was limited to Brazil with the U.S. under Donald Trump in his first term and his second term. During Donald Trump's first term, 2017 to 2021, his administration showed limited engagement with multilateral forums in Asia, and by implication, a broader disengagement from regional institutions globally, which contributed to perceptions of U.S. unreliability among strategic partners. Although it doesn't matter, it does establish a pattern of Trump's transactional foreign policy and diplomatic absences that regional powers interpreted as declining U.S. commitment to global order. Remember, It was stated in the documentary, the short piece of video I showed you, that Joe Biden only visited Latin America one time during his presidency, and that was to attend a G20 conference. The same was true for Donald Trump. Has only been to Latin America one time, and that was because of a G20 conference that took place there. I'm skipping over a little bit of this. It's repeating. This growing Brazil-China partnership is viewed by Donald Trump's inner circle as a threat to U.S. supremacy in Latin America. Trump's approach is seen as an attempt to pressure Brazil into a binary choice between alignment with the U.S. or China, which contradicts Brazil's foreign policy goal of maintaining autonomy and leadership in the global south. Some in Brasilia believe the U.S. is trying to influence Brazil's domestic politics to favor a conservative government more aligned with Washington, such as that of former President Jair Bolsonaro, who is more accommodating to U.S. demands. However, this strategy may be backfiring, as President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva has benefited from a rally around the flag effect in response to U.S. pressure. Brazilian foreign policy elites increasingly view the U.S. as an unreliable partner, a perception reinforced by Trump's adversarial stance toward traditional allies like Canada, Europe, Mexico, and Japan. Thus, under Trump's second term, Brazil's alignment with China has strengthened in response to U.S. tariffs and perceived bullying, accelerating a shift toward a multipolar world order that Brazil seeks to help shape. I asked to describe this breakdown in relations between Trump and this list of Latin American nations, which includes Brazil, Cuba, Chile, Colombia, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Mexico, Nicaragua, Venezuela. And here is a country-by-country breakdown of how relationships with the U.S. have frayed under President Trump, and how each nation is pivoting towards China in growing influence in Latin America. We talked extensively about Brazil. Next up is Cuba, in alphabetical order. Trump reversed Obama-era détente with Cuba to extent that Obama-era détente with Cuba did not include Guantanamo, where the U.S. is still 30 years later, or 25 years later, I guess it'd be, has prisoners locked up in Guantanamo Bay over the 9/11 incidences. 24 years later, you're still locked up without trial. Trump reversed Obama-era détente with Cuba, reinstating travel restrictions, tightening sanctions, and redesignating Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism. These moves crippled Cuba's tourism-dependent economy and further isolated the island diplomatically. In response, Cuba leaned more heavily on China, which has expanded its role in telecommunications, biotech, and infrastructure. Cuba joined the Belt and Road Initiative and has welcomed Chinese investment in ports and renewable energy. Beijing's support has helped Cuba weather U.S. pressure, and the two nations now share a robust strategic partnership rooted in mutual opposition to U.S. hegemony. Let's look at Chile. While Chile maintained formal ties with the U.S., Trump's protectionist trade policies and withdrawal from multilateral agreements cooled relationships. Chile, a champion of free trade, found more alignment with China's global economic vision. China is now Chile's top trading partner, especially in copper exports. Chile joined the Belt and Road Initiative and signed multiple cooperation agreements with Beijing. Chinese firms have invested in Chile's lithium sector and public transportation. The shift reflects Chile's pragmatic approach to global power dynamics, favoring economic diversification and infrastructure development over ideological alignment with Washington. I think you can see a pattern here. Is anybody talking to me? Does anybody find this stuff to be interesting other than me? Personally, I think it is fascinating. But let's continue. You may not agree. Colombia. Trump's hardline stance on drug policy and threats to decertify Colombia as a partner strain a historically close alliance. Tensions escalated over migration, extradition, and Colombia's handling of cocoa cultivation. Not cocoa, coca cultivation, coca. In parallel, Colombia expanded ties with China, joining the Belt and Road Initiative and seeking Chinese investment in railways, mining, and energy. China is now Colombia's second largest trading partner. The pivot reflects Colombia's desire to diversify its economic partnerships and reduce dependence on U.S. aid, especially as Washington's approach became more punitive and less cooperative under Trump. El Salvador. Relations soured under Trump due to migration disputes and criticism of El Salvador's domestic policies. The U.S. cut aid and pressured the country to sign asylum agreements. In response, El Salvador broke ties with Taiwan in 2018 and embraced China, joining the Belt and Road Initiative. China has since funded major infrastructure projects, including a national library and sports stadium. President Bukele's government has welcomed Chinese investment as a counterbalance to U.S. influence, signaling a strategic realignment that prioritizes economic development over traditional diplomatic loyalties. Guatemala. The Trump administration leaned heavily on Guatemala to enforce migration controls, including controversial asylum agreements. While Guatemala complied, the relationship was marked by coercion and conditional aid. Despite maintaining ties with Taiwan, Guatemala has begun exploring economic opportunities with China. Chinese firms are active in mining and construction, and political voices within Guatemala are increasingly advocating for a diplomatic shift. The Trump-era pressures has fueled skepticism about U.S. intentions, prompting Guatemala to hedge its bets and consider China as a viable alternative for trade and investment. I think we can see the pattern. There are more countries. It keeps going. Honduras. Trump's immigration policies and threats to cut aid strained relationship with Honduras. The administration's emphasis on border enforcement overshadowed broader cooperation. In 2023, Honduras severed ties with Taiwan and formally recognized China, joining the Belt and Road Initiative. Chinese investment followed swiftly, targeting energy, infrastructure, and agriculture. The diplomatic shift marked a clear pivot toward Beijing, driven by promises of development and trade. Honduras now views China as a strategic partner capable of delivering economic benefits without the political strings which are often attached to U.S. aid. Mexico. Despite initial attempts at cooperation, Trump's aggressive rhetoric on immigration, border security, and trade created persistent tension with Mexico. Tariff threats and renegotiating of NAFTA, now the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, strained economic ties. In response, Mexico has cautiously expanded its relationship with China, though it remains wary of antagonizing the U.S. Chinese investment in manufacturing and logistics has grown, and Mexico is reviewing its trade policies to limit Chinese backdoor access to U.S. markets. While not fully aligned with Beijing, Mexico's pivot reflects a pragmatic effort to diversify amid unpredictable U.S. policy. Nicaragua. The Trump administration's imposed sanctions on Nicaragua over human rights abuses and authoritarian governance under President Daniel Ortega. Relations deteriorated rapidly, with the U.S. cutting aid and targeting key officials. In 2021, Nicaragua dropped diplomatic recognition of Taiwan and embraced China, joining the Belt and Road Initiative. China has since signed a free trade agreement and launched infrastructure projects, including a new airport. The Ortega regime views China as a reliable ally against U.S. pressure, and the partnership has deepened across economic, political, and military domains. Venezuela. The Trump administration took a confrontational stance on Venezuela, imposing sweeping sanctions and recognizing opposition leader Juan Guaido as interim president. U.S. sought regime change, isolating Maduro's government diplomatically and economically. In response, Venezuela turned decisively toward China, which has provided billions in loans, oil for credit deals, and infrastructure support. China remains a key lifeline for Maduro, backing Venezuela in international forums and resisting U.S. efforts to delegitimize the regime. The alliance underscores China's role as a counterweight to U.S. influence in Latin America. So there's one more story on Venezuela I want to cover here, and this is the latest on military tensions over Venezuela and the sinking of the boat. That's the story I'm looking it up. I'm going to pull it from not U.S. Press. I'm going to pull this from the Independent. Which I consider to be a reliable non-U.S. based news outlet. The article I pulled up entitled Venezuela's to 284 battlefront locations as tensions with the U.S. rise. Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro raised the stakes and said the country was ready for an armed fight. This dated yesterday, Thursday, 11th of September, 2025. Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro said he would deploy military and militias to 284, quote, battlefront, unquote, locations across his country as tensions with the U.S. rise following a deadly strike last week. Flanked by his defense minister, Maduro raised the stakes in a state television broadcast Thursday morning. Quote, we're ready for an armed fight if it's necessary, Maduro said from Ciudad Caribia on the country's central coast, Reuters reported. Along all the Venezuelan coast, from the border with Colombia to the east of the country, from north to south and east to west, we have a full preparation of official troops, he said. The escalation follows a lethal U.S. strike last week on what President Donald Trump claimed was a boat smuggling drugs out of Venezuela for the Tren de Aragua gang. Trump alleged that the shipment in the Caribbean Sea was led by the Venezuelan president, which Maduro denied. The strike on the vessel killed 11 people, which is the first known U.S. military attack against alleged drug traffickers since the Trump administration began sending warships to the Caribbean last month. Quote, please let this serve as a notice to anyone even thinking about bringing drugs into the United States. Quote, beware, unquote, Trump wrote last week. But the administration has since shared little information about the strike. Venezuela's interior minister said Thursday that none of the 11 people killed aboard the vessel belonged to Tren de Aragua. They openly confessed to killing 11 people, Diosdado Cabello said on state television. Quote, we have done our investigations here in our country, and there are the families of the disappeared people who want their relatives. And when we asked in the towns, none of them were from Tren de Aragua. None were drug traffickers. A murder has been committed against a group of citizens using lethal force, Cabello added. The minister questioned how the U.S. could determine whether drugs were on board the vessel and asked why the individuals were not arrested instead. I'm going to repeat that. That's two important points. The minister questioned how the U.S. could determine whether drugs were on board the vessel and asked why the individuals were not arrested instead. The Independent has contacted the Pentagon for comment. Vice President J.D. Vance was among those fiercely defending the strike and said that he doesn't give a S*** if people consider the action a war crime. He doesn't give a sh if people consider the action a war crime. Killing cartel members who poison our fellow citizens is the highest and best use of our military, unquote, Vance said in a post on X at the weekend. It is unclear how the U.S. military presence in the region will disrupt the drug trade. The ships are part of an enhanced counter-narcotics operation to carry out drug interdiction missions in Latin America, a defense official told the Washington Post last week. Phil Gunson, a Caracas-based political analyst for the International Crisis Group, believes the operation, quote, is likely to be an expensive failure, since at best it will only temporarily disrupt trafficking in the Eastern Caribbean. But he added, quote, there are ancillary goals, including the destabilization of the Maduro government and possibly even its collapse. That's something U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has long promoted. but there appears to be no clear plan as to how to achieve it, and even less of an idea of how to deal with the chaos that might ensue, unquote. Trump has long blamed Venezuela for a drug epidemic in the U.S., claiming Caracas is pouring narcotics in through illegal channels. Venezuela has denied the allegations, asserting that the vast majority of cocaine produced in Colombia departs through the Pacific. Maduro is widely considered a dictator and not recognized by the U.S. as Venezuela's legitimate leader. He was sworn into a third six-year term in January, and he maintains he was the legitimate winner of the presidential election last year. So this takes, there's more. The opposition, however, said there is credible evidence that its candidate had won the vote, as it urged the U.S. and other countries to ramp up pressure on Maduro to force him out of office. The Trump administration announced a $50 million reward last month for Maduro's arrest, accusing him of being one of the world's largest drug traffickers and working with cartels to flood the U.S. with fentanyl-laced cocaine. Maduro denies any connection to the drug trade. So that takes us to the end of our research. And the countries that are involved in rapidly deteriorating relations with the U.S. and increasing trade, cooperation, collaboration with the BRICS Plus nation, including joining the Belt and Road Initiative, the world's largest infrastructure creation plan in history, led by the government of Xi Jinping, China's government. What do you think? And do you have any opinions on today's broadcast? Let me just quickly poll you. And I don't see any response at all. We do the best we can. I was reading from the African Future today, and you can get your copy at http://keidi.biz/CRP Conscious Russia Press 2012. And I highly recommend that you do get your copy. It's a good book. It really is. It will give you, if you've never had it, a count of all of the African people in the world, and at present there are in excess of 1,755,000,000 African people around the world. That's more than India. That's more than Chinese people, more than Indians in the diaspora as well as in India, more than Chinese in China or the diaspora. African people all over the world. I spent months putting those statistics together. I think, well, in a fair world, I would be compensated for doing that work. So I want to thank you all for tuning in. And on that note, I'm going to wrap it up for right now. You've been tuned into LIB Radio. LIB been tuned into livinginblack.com. It's Friday, so we're going into another weekend. I hope you're going to have a busy weekend. I may just plant my garden tomorrow, replant it early, get a little jump on the cooler weather, so I can get in my crops. I'm pretty sure I'm going to do that today or tomorrow. Are you a gardener? You're probably pulling out your crops as I'm getting ready to plant a fall crop here in Las Vegas. It's a beautiful thing, and we encourage such activity. Food is something so very important, and food inflation costs have been terrible, absolutely terrible. So we're planning on strategic moves to take control over what is happening. And we are your favorite. We aim to be your favorite. We are LAB Radio, LABD. We are livinginblack.com. Tell your friends to tell their friends that we have our own now. We're very proud of who we are, what we have, and what we do on labradio.com.